Welcome to Forum 360. I'm Leslie Ungar, your host today. When we think of a rabbi, many of us think of a very old, hopefully wise man with a beard and perhaps a very tall black hat. We may not think of a rabbi that is a Cavs fan by marriage, went to Miami of Ohio, or came to us from Omaha. We may not think of a rabbi still in his 30s. When Temple Israel, a congregation that has been in Akron since the 1860s, went looking for a new rabbi, they found Rabbi Josh Brown. You could say the Browns moved to Akron. We welcome Rabbi Brown of Akron to the community, and we welcome him to Forum 360. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're kind of lucky. The last new rabbi in town, I drove him in my stick shift to bring him here. So you might be considered lucky that you didn't have to drive in my stick shift.
Oh, one day.
One day.
One day.
Let's go back to growing up in Atlanta.
Yeah.
You're Atlanta, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which we don't really think of as the Jewish Mecca of the world, you know.
No.
But if we talk to your Sunday school teachers or your public school teachers, would the fact that you became a rabbi surprise them?
If you talk to my teachers, I don't know that it probably would surprise them. Not in the sense that I was a misbehaving kid too much, or as many I think clergy can claim that they were the kids who misbehaved and then grew up to lead a congregation. But I think if you talk to my friends, they wouldn't be surprised. I think my friends, I always liked to organize my friends, and I always liked to get them involved in the synagogue. And if you talk to my rabbi, I don't think he would be surprised. We were very close, and I think it was obvious from a young age that I admired him. And I tried to spend a lot of time with him, and that had a major influence on not only my career, but on my life in general.
Now, when you were like 5 and other kids said, I want to be a fireman or a policeman or a lawyer, what did you say when you were 5?
Oh gosh, I probably said I wanted to be a veterinarian. Yeah, I like you, I love animals, and like a lot of kids, I could see myself spending all day hanging out with the animals. But I do think when I was that age, it was in Atlanta, and especially living in the city of Atlanta, I was in a very diverse school. It was unique to be Jewish, so I think that also had an impact on my life in that way. So when I was 5, I wanted to be a veterinarian, but I was very clear that I was Jewish.
You'd be a Jewish vet.
I would be a Jewish veterinarian,
a Jewish vet.
Right.
Now, was there a defining moment when you knew that you wanted to be a rabbi? Or was it just part of a process that you kind of went down that road?
It was a process. It was a process of elimination in many ways, and then so it was always something I was interested in, and I was also very interested in psychology. I was a psychology major at first in college, but then I found that I didn't enjoy the scientific side of psychology, and I changed my major to social work. When I did that, I really had a struggle, or sort of the big question of, well, what am I going to do with that degree? Changed because psychology degree, in my mind, was going to lead me to being a clinical psychologist. And now this opened up the field, and I started looking around and thinking about what I really enjoyed about social work. And I thought back to my rabbi and thought about how a lot of what he did was it was based on a lot of the skills I was learning. I love the dynamic nature of families, especially in our modern age when families are changing by the day, it seems.
And what is a family is changing?
And what is a family is changing. Mm-hmm. And I think that in some ways it felt as though I was on the frontier academically, that was a field that was just growing. This idea that families were all of a sudden going to be very different in the next few years, and we've seen that happen. That was fascinating to me, and of course, the Jewish family has changed like every other family, so that was a wonderful place for my two passions to intersect.
Now, what about your parents? Was there a time, can you remember, that you coming out where you came to them and said, Mom, Dad, I'm going to be a rabbi?
I think I told them that I was going to apply to rabbinical school. And I think my dad was very proud and my mom was very worried. She was, I think, intimidated by the idea of her son being a rabbi. What does that mean religiously? I think there's a lot of assumed judgments that go along with those of us who consider ourselves religious that are hopefully not true. And also, I think she was concerned about the lifestyle of a rabbi. It's not like any American pastor. It's not a 9-to-5 Monday to Friday job, and that concerned her. But they were very active in our synagogue growing up, and so they were supportive.
But now, speaking of concern,
Yeah.
I have to tell the viewers and the listeners that you have an adorable wife, Carrie.
Yeah.
Is being married to a rabbi a hard sell when you're dating?
Yes, I think it is. I think that's a challenge that many of us face. I think it's more of a challenge actually for men. I think it's more of a challenge after we get married because I think a lot is assumed or expected of our wives in a traditional sense. And again, we live in an era where many, if not most, couples are dual income families, and the idea that the rabbi's wife, once called the Rebbitzin, would essentially work for the synagogue is not a concept that my family adopts or that is realistic for us. But I would also say that in the movement that I'm a part of, we ordain many women, and we're open and welcoming to the gay and lesbian, bisexual and transgender community. And I do think that for those, for that segment of our community, I think if you were to ask them this question, it's even more challenging. I think as a minority within a minority, to then claim that you're a religious professional doesn't make dating as easy. I think as a man, I maybe had a little bit of benefit that people have seen a rabbi in a masculine role for a long time and in a heterosexual role. And so for my gay colleagues and for my female colleagues, they would tell you that it poses some interesting challenges.
Now, when you talked about you touched upon, kind of different kinds of Judaism. Some viewers and listeners may know or may not know that there are 3 different kinds of Judaism. So how did you select to be a Reform rabbi?
Well, first and foremost, I grew up in the Reform movement. Although I would tell you that I'm enamored with traditional Judaism. I've spent a lot of time studying and praying in the Orthodox community. But I think I've debated whether I should move movements or not. But ultimately, the Reform movement allows for choice. And I think it allows for a certain level of freedom that we can live by our values fully and be fully honest with what we believe personally. And that the other movements in Judaism, I think, are a little more constricting in terms of following certain Jewish laws according to standards that were set many centuries ago. And so the Reform movement has been the only one. I have plenty of criticism of the Reform movement too, but I think it's the only one that works for me because of its flexibility.
The Constitution and kind of Orthodox Judaism have a lot in common.
Yes.
With is it a living, breathing religion?
Correct. That's right.
Like, is it Constitution living, breathing that changes? Because as smart as the founders were, they couldn't have thought about Twitter or anything else. Or is it something that you take exactly as it has been taken for years and years? It's kind of a similarity there I hadn't thought about.
Right, and so I love how dynamic it can be, and how I think Jewish tradition can inform every aspect of our life. I believe deeply, but I don't believe it should be stagnant, and I don't believe that that rabbis from thousands of years ago know the intricacies of the details of our lives. But I do think they have a lot of wisdom on the broad strokes of our lives that we should generally listen to more often.
Now, you listened to some wisdom when you finished being an assistant rabbi and you had options where to go for your own pulpit. What brought you to Northeast Ohio?
Well, it was a number of things. First and foremost, we have family in the area, and I went to college, as you mentioned, in Ohio, and so I have a love for Ohio. Even though I didn't grow up in Ohio, it does have a sense of home for me. But I think there are some unique things about Ohio that as I've lived throughout a lot of states in our country, Ohio's unique in that it's got beautiful areas. I think Northeast Ohio, the park system is phenomenal. And that's something, as I've gotten older, that I really value, being able to get to a park in a few minutes, and the beautiful parks that we have in Summit County especially. So that was really important to me personally. But also the nature of Ohio is interesting. It's set up almost in a New England style in some ways. You've got all these townships around, and yet you're not on the East Coast. So you've got a Midwestern environment or culture, and yet you have, I think, the quaint nature of the Northeast. And so my wife and I both, we find that romantic. We find that nice. We think it's a good place to raise our kids. But there are a lot of good places to raise kids. So I think the beauty and the culture and the Midwestern sense within the sort of New England setting was nice for us.
Now you moved here actually the day the Cavs won the title.
Yes, we take full credit.
And then you got to live through the World Series.
Yes.
I hate to be the one to tell you that, sports isn't always, like that in Northeast
Right.
Ohio, but I think the Browns have kind of tipped you off to
Yes,
that.
correct.
But what are some things that you see as someone that's recently come to Northeast Ohio that perhaps we that have lived here, perhaps born here, that we don't see or we take for granted?
I think people in Northeast Ohio take for granted how much they have at their fingertips. I think that, and maybe that's a Midwestern mentality also, that we sort of, as Midwesterners, we have our own inferiority complex to the coast. But the truth is, I've lived on both coasts, and we have everything in Cleveland and much of it in Akron. Last night, in fact, I was at a wonderful jazz club in Akron. It was as good as being in Manhattan. It was terrific. The arts here are second to none, and the sense of community here. The fact that we're about to approach an election, and here we are. This is an important place to be, and I think that there's truth to that. I think I've been in places where it doesn't really matter what your vote is because the state isn't as diverse in its populace. And here in Ohio, we've got
diverse.
everything. We're diverse.
We are diverse.
We've got, and I think that we take that for granted, I would say. Growing up in Atlanta, we didn't take that for granted because we had a history of civil rights. And so we knew that was our claim to fame. And I do think sports here tend to be the first thing people mention. But that sometimes covers up the fact that there's a deep culture within the African American community and the Jewish community. We look at Little Italy and all these different, in Akron, I've gotten to know the Greek community well. These are deep, wonderful values for our community to have that not everybody gets to experience.
And sometimes we take for granted.
We do.
We are talking today to the new rabbi in town, Rabbi Josh Brown. You could say the Browns moved to Akron just 4 or 5 months into his being rabbi for Temple Israel in Akron. Now, do you have time in your day to be spiritual?
When I prioritize it, I think that it's not an obvious piece, and that's something that we all have to make time for. So when I make time, I try to, if I've been working in the last year, especially on meditation, but sometimes I have to pull over off the side of the road and meditate in my car because
before you go home to 3 kids.
Before I go home to 3 kids.
Under the age of 5?
Before I go home to 3 kids, or sometimes right after I drop them off. I find that there's something about setting your intention for the day. It's hard to do with 3 kids in the morning, but I try to still find time for that. That's a challenging task, I think, but I try.
Now, what would you say a Jewish person today, maybe any person, but we'll just talk about Jews, what can a Jewish person today expect to get from their religion?
Wow. I think that they can expect, first and foremost, to have a meaningful experience that I believe can save their life. I think that the religion, Judaism as an example, can be like medicine. I think more and more the healthcare world is seeing that that's true. There are great benefits, physical, spiritual benefits that directly impact people's lives when they're a part of a larger community, when they feel they're a part of something larger than themselves, and when they have a spiritual practice that helps them to focus and relax. I think we have an increasingly anxious world and an increasingly distracted world because we have so much media, and I don't mean that in terms of just television. I mean media just things entering into our world constantly. And we don't necessarily, it's a little countercultural to say we should focus more. And I think religion, Judaism in particular, tells us that we need to focus more and that we need to find balance. That's one of the major teachings, I think, of our religion, is finding a sense of balance in our life. And whatever is knocking us out of whack, we should find our way back to being on solid ground.
Well, speaking of balance,
Yes.
I look at any rabbi and I say, okay, you've got a congregation made up of all kinds of different factions and beliefs. How do you satisfy all of them? How do you find a balance? Some say it's too little Hebrew, some say it's too much Hebrew, some say it's too little music, some say it's too much music, some say the services are too early, some say the services are too late, some say that you talk about Israel too much, some say you don't talk about Israel enough. How do you find balance among hundreds of different opinions?
Yeah. You don't. I think in that sense we're not. I hope that I don't, and that we as a religion don't see ourselves as some sort of a politician trying to win over the electorate, or one of my favorite quotes is that compromise is when everybody's unhappy. And so I think that as a community leader, as a rabbi, we're first and foremost a teacher. And I think when teachers go into their class, they don't go into their class saying, well, I want to make sure all of my students feel entertained and happy and satisfied. I think our goal is higher than that. I think it's to move people from one place to the next. And hopefully people gain trust in us to know that most of the time we're going to try and move them in a good direction. Hopefully we're always trying to move them in a good direction. I can't say we're always get it right, but that hopefully that's what I look to do. I think we're trying to move people on their journey and get to a destination, not necessarily find some way to satisfy them. I think we end up always losing when we do that.
Now, it's I don't know if it's a joke or if it's true, but
Yeah.
it's kind of accepted that after a bar mitzvah, when a child is 13,
Yeah.
whether they're a girl or boy and have had a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, that they kind of don't find their way back to temple for a
it's
while,
very true.
right?
Yes.
So, how do you bring back or keep young people engaged and not wait until they maybe get married or have kids?
Yeah.
And there isn't this 10 or 15-year gap.
Yeah.
How do you keep young people engaged?
In my opinion, it's a counterintuitive answer. You keep young people engaged by focusing on adults. I think for a long time we've
It's kind of like you train a dog by focusing on the owner.
It's exactly right. It's exactly right. And I think
counterintuitive.
That's exactly right. We for a long time Judaism has focused on education and on youth education, and I'm not saying that that's not important. It is, but for a long time our kids have been watching as they were the only ones getting educated, and so they want to be adults. And when they become 13, we say, now you get to be like all of the other adults. And so they say, well, good, then I don't have to come. And so I think that the kids want to be adults. We need to have, if it's meaningful to them, the kids who have parents who find the synagogue a meaningful place tend to be the ones, in my opinion, and from my experience, who also find the synagogue to be a meaningful place. And our goal is not to indoctrinate anybody with a certain amount of information. It's to impact their life. So in teaching my 7th graders just this year, I was glad when I asked them exactly that question, what would keep you involved and why do you think your parents want you to be here? And they answered, they said, because when a crisis comes along, this is the place that'll be there for me. And when a time of celebration comes along, this is the place that'll celebrate with me. And I think that's valuable and that has meaning for them. And I think that we can do that better than most.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question that I want a yes or no answer only because of the question that's going to follow.
Yeah, sure.
Is American Jewry doomed to assimilation?
No.
Then the 3 biggest challenges for American Jewry today?
What are they? Mm-hmm. The 3 biggest challenges for American Jewry today are, I think, a lack of education in our own tradition. I think the diversifying nature of the country, but also of our community in particular. And the third one I would put along with that, and that is that geographically we're spreading out, and so that's a real challenge. It's hard to, we're a small people in number. And so there's 6 or 7, some maybe 8, depending on how you're counting, 8 million Jews in America. But we're spread out over the country, and we used to be relatively
big cities.
Big city oriented, but also certain neighborhoods. We would be on the Lower East Side or the Upper West Side, or we would be on the north side of Chicago. Now we find that which is all for good reason. The Jews feel comfortable living in lots of small towns. But there may not be a Jewish community there, and so keeping Jews connected is a challenge facing us.
We recently experienced at home what we have named digital Shiva, when you can't really have a Shiva in person. Yeah. So we've named it digital Shiva.
Yeah.
Do you think that anti-Israel sentiments are at their heart anti-Jewish sentiments?
Often, I think when the litmus test that I use is if the anti-Israel sentiments are unique, are unique to Israel, and yet the situation is not unique. So, for instance, there are lots of people suffering in the world. If Israel is the only country that's called out when there are dozens of countries that are doing things that maybe the world thinks is not the best. Or often it's the case that Israel is doing something that maybe is questionable, but by comparison to a country that's nearby or other, if we look at Africa as an example, you can have hundreds of thousands of people suffering from mass genocide, and it seems that Israel often gets the finger pointed at them when they try to defend themselves, rather with a lot of aggression, and that's a challenge. I think that becomes anti-Semitism, but that's a hard line to find, and I think this movement of boycotting Israeli products and the things like that, we would wonder why is the boycott there and not of Syrian products or not of Sudanese products, when we've known for years that those are issues. So I think that the world has to have a broad spectrum, and also I would say a spectrum. Something I struggled with was also Israel gets criticized a lot for the disproportionate amount of deaths that happen between the battles with Palestinians and Arab countries. But America has killed thousands of civilians in our wars. We don't talk about that. So sometimes it's easier to criticize a country that's across the world, and it blocks us from looking at the actions of our own country. And so I think we need to do the hard work internally and externally.
Now, in addition to hard work, in about a minute, I'm going to ask you, we'll call this the lightning round, how many questions I can get through in 1 or 2 words. What music is playing on your iPhone or in your car right now?
What music? I have a CD of a congregation that does beautiful music in Los Angeles, spiritual music, spiritual Jewish music.
What is the best thing since you've moved here?
Oh gosh, the best thing since I've moved here? Beyond the warm embrace, I would say being in the parks in the fall, hiking with the beautiful colors.
Something that you miss from Omaha?
Something that I miss from Omaha. The people, first and foremost, amazing people in Omaha. And food. It's incredible what that side of the Midwest can bring.
And although there could be 100, one thing, tell us just one thing one way a rabbi can have an impact on a person or a congregation.
Pray with them. I think prayer changes people, and when we pray together, we have the real ability to change each other.
All of us, as individuals, as companies, we're all challenged to think differently. We tend to build the same box over and over again. To audience members, Jewish and non-Jewish, we may all have the idea of a rabbi in a figurative box. Today, Rabbi Josh Brown who we chose out of the entire country to come to Northeast Ohio, and who chose to come to Northeast Ohio to raise his family and do his life's work, has been our guest. He may not fit your box of what a rabbi looks or sounds like. That's good. As the saying goes, we all need to get out of our box. For Forum 360, we welcome the Browns moving to Akron. I'm Leslie Ungar. Thank you for joining us on Forum 360 for your global outlook with a local view.
Forum 360 is brought to you with support from Electric Impulse Communications, Kim and Harvey Nelson, Rubber City Radio Group, Akronist.com, Hudson Cable, Medical Mutual of Ohio, Forum 360 supporters, and the Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron.